The great being saith, the heaven of divine wisdom is illumined with the two luminaries of consultation and compassion. Take ye counsel together in all matters, inasmuch as consultation is the lamp of guidance which leadeth the way, and is the bestower of understanding. Baha'u'llah.
Thank you. So now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. This week, our speaker is Dr. Michael Karlberg, and his topic is Competition or Cooperation, a Baha'i Perspective. Dr. Michael Karlberg is a professor of communication studies at Western Washington University. His scholarship examines prevailing conceptions of human nature, power, social organization, and social change, and their implications for the pursuit of peace and justice. He authored the books Beyond the Culture of Contest and Constructing Social Reality, as well as numerous articles on related themes. And with that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Karlberg.
Thank you, Paymane. So I've been asked to offer my perspective as a Baha'i on the relative merits of competition and cooperation. And it seems helpful to start with a few words on the Baha'i faith itself, just so my comments can be understood in some context. As many of you probably already know, Baha'i faith had its origins in the teachings of Baha'u'llah, who was born into one of the wealthiest and most influential families in Persia, modern-day Iran, 2 centuries ago. And Persia in that time was a land of extreme wealth and poverty. It was, in essence, a feudal society. The vast majority of the population was illiterate and lived under very difficult conditions, and the fruits of their labors were extracted by aristocratic and ecclesiastical elites. And as a young man, despite being born into a position of wealth and privilege, Baha'u'llah turned his back on that to devote all his time and energy to serving the most marginalized and impoverished segments of the population. And as still a young man, he became known in his country as the father of the poor. In his 20s, he also became a leading champion of a spiritual movement that was sweeping the country, which rejected the established ecclesiastical hierarchy and shook the foundations of the social order in Persia. And in response, the political and religious authorities conspired to kill over 10,000 of those participating in this movement and threw Baha'u'llah into an underground cesspit, anticipating he would die weighted down by heavy chains with a group of other prisoners. But Baha'u'llah survived for 4 months under those conditions. And during that time, he had a revelation in which he came to understand that his mission was to usher in the age of humanity's spiritual maturity by laying the foundations of a global civilization that would embody the principle of the oneness of humanity and would be organized around the principle of justice. So after surviving that experience, Baha'u'llah was exiled from Persia to spend the remaining 40 years of his life as a prisoner of the neighboring Ottoman Empire. And during those 40 years of suffering, Baha'u'llah laid out the principles of the Baha'i faith and guided the development of a growing community across the region who sought to apply those spiritual principles to the development of new patterns of social existence. Now, about 170 years later, today, the Baha'i community has grown to be a worldwide community, firmly established in every part of the planet, taken up by people from every cultural and religious background on earth who continue this work. The community really is a microcosm of humanity. Millions of diverse people working within a shared framework of social and spiritual transformation, laying the foundations of a more peaceful, just, and prosperous global civilization. So this is the context in which I offer my comments as a participant in this global movement. So let's think a little bit about competition and cooperation. I'm assuming Some number of you grew up in the West, perhaps in the United States. And if so, probably have been taught in countless ways at schools and universities, through the media, through the rhetoric of politicians and economists, that competition is the most productive way to organize not only our political and economic affairs, but many other social practices. In some ways, it's the central value of American society. What I refer to as the culture of contest in my work. So in this culture of contest, we organize governance as a partisan political contest. We organize the economy as a contest of capital accumulation. We organize the justice system as a contest of legal advocacy. We organize education as a contest for grades and recognition. We even organize most forms of recreation and leisure as physical or mental contests. And I want to ask you to reflect for a moment. How's this working out for us? Are most people in this culture of contest happy? Is our partisan political system governing us in responsible, just, and sustainable ways? Is our capitalist economy functioning in a sustainable way and providing meaningful and dignified employment to the entire population? Is our justice system protecting the rights of marginalized communities? Is our education system preparing each generation to meet the challenges now facing humanity? And is it ensuring equal opportunity for all, regardless of race, gender, class? There's actually mountains of evidence that the answer to every one of these questions is a resounding no. The culture of contest is failing most people miserably, and it's utterly abandoned the most vulnerable among us, right? In the wealthiest nation on the planet, 1 in 5 children live below the poverty line. White people control 17 times as much wealth per capita as Black people. We dump toxic waste in the backyards of poor and marginalized communities across the country. We're pumping so much CO2 into the air, we're destabilizing the entire planetary atmosphere. We've ushered in another age of mass extinction on par with the extinction of the dinosaurs. In our competition with other nations, we spend over $1 trillion a year on weapons of mass destruction that serve no productive purpose. And I could go on, and I'm sure you could all add to this list, but I think you get the point. Now, these outcomes of the culture of contest really shouldn't surprise us. Because when you organize every social institution as a contest of power, you simply end up privileging the short-term material interests of those who enter the contest with the most inherited power. And in the process, social institutions become incapable of managing human affairs in responsible, just, and sustainable ways. So, if the culture of contest is so problematic, we need to ask ourselves, why does it persist? Why is it so hard to move beyond the culture of contest? Well, one reason it's hard is because a set of very powerful myths have been constructed to perpetuate the culture of contest. I want to just run through a few of these myths. Now, the first myth is that human nature is invariably selfish, aggressive, and competitive. But on closer inspection, this is just a myth. What the human sciences actually demonstrate is that humans are wired for both competition and cooperation, or egoism and altruism. And which of these latent potentials becomes more fully developed depends on how we're raised, on our education and training, on our social environment, on our institutional structures and incentive systems, and on the choices we make as we navigate all these things. But within the culture of contest, the selfish, aggressive, and competitive view of human nature becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, the second myth is that excellence, creativity, productivity, innovation are all best promoted through self-interested competition. Again, this is a myth. What the human sciences are beginning to demonstrate here is that self-interest is not the only human motivation, nor is it the most powerful. Excellence, creativity, productivity, these are in themselves intrinsic sources of motivation. Also, people can be motivated by the desire to live a meaningful life, to align ourselves with a higher cause or purpose, to contribute to the betterment of the world, and to work cooperatively with others towards these ends. These are deep wells of human motivation. And tapping into these forms of human motivation is another way, I would argue a more effective way, to promote real excellence, creativity, innovation, productivity. Because what a lot of studies actually demonstrate is that competition actually undermines the pursuit of excellence, creativity, and productivity. And I can give examples of this later when we have more of a sort of conversation. But I want to get to the third myth, which underlies this culture of contest. And it's the myth that competition drives evolution itself. Again, turns out this is a myth. What evolutionary biology is actually beginning to show is that mutualism is an equally powerful, if not more powerful, evolutionary force. Mutualism gave us the nucleated cell and multicellular organisms that are the foundations of all complex life. Mutualism gave us the balance of oxygen and carbon dioxide in our atmosphere that sustains all complex life. Mutualism between species confers powerful survival advantages. And mutualism within species, or what we call cooperation in human societies, also confers powerful survival advantages. This is the most basic reason humans have been so incredibly successful as a species, because we have unprecedented capacities for cooperation on unprecedented scales. And this is what the teachings of Baha'u'llah point towards: the need to further foster and develop our cooperative capacities, and to regulate and discipline our competitive instincts. So the Baha'i Faith rejects the notion that society is merely an arena of competition for scarce resources in which a small number will be winners and most will be losers. Baha'u'llah taught that a maturing human society is like an interdependent social body in which every individual and group has to derive their well-being from the well-being of the entire social body and also give back to support that well-being. This is what the principle of the oneness of humanity means. And this principle, the principle of oneness, is the central organizing principle of Baha'u'llah's teachings. And in the context of this principle of oneness, the principle of justice takes on its fullest meaning. Justice requires that every individual and group be given the fullest possible opportunity to develop their latent potential to contribute to the well-being of the entire society. This is the world that most human beings have aspired towards for millennia. And at this moment in history, it's now possible for the first time to translate this aspiration into a new social reality. But to do this, we have to learn our way forward. We don't yet know how, to reorganize human affairs on this scale. We have to learn how to reorganize human affairs around the principles of cooperation, reciprocity, and mutual empowerment. And the longer we delay, the greater will become the scale of human suffering. So this is no longer merely an idealistic aspiration. It's an existential imperative. Just consider the current global pandemic that we've all been suffering through for the last year, right? We cannot address challenges like this without developing new capacities for cooperation on a global scale. And we see hints of this already. I mean, the unbelievable speed with which vaccines were developed is actually an example of that kind of cooperation on a massive scale within the scientific community. But really getting this under control as quickly as possible requires cooperation on still greater scales, both within countries like the United States and around the planet. Or we can consider the catastrophic threat of global warming. Again, we cannot address existential threats like this without developing new capacities for cooperation on a global scale. So in essence, our species has transformed the conditions of our own existence. And social habits and cultural patterns we developed in the past are now becoming deeply maladaptive. The culture of contest is one of those deeply maladaptive patterns that we have to abandon as we learn how to reorganize human affairs around the principle of cooperation or around the principle of oneness. And the good news is there are many promising trends in this direction. We're already a good ways down that path, but there's still a tremendous amount of work to do, amount of learning to do, amount of capacity building to engage in. So it's becoming increasingly urgent that we get on with this work. And that was the essence of Baha'u'llah's teachings and of his warning, that the longer we delay, the longer we drag our feet, the more suffering we'll face. Because 7.5, going on 8 billion people on this planet can't continue to, operate in this sort of constant competition. And in essence, we've overcome the basic struggle for survival that sort of brought us here. We have the capacity now through science and technology to meet, the basic needs of everyone on this planet, but only if we learn how to live together successfully as a single, interdependent social body. So maybe I can pause here. I'd rather have more of a conversation with you. I'm sure you've all given thought to this and have comments or questions, and I understand that we have the capacity for that to open up the conversation. So maybe I'll hand it back to Heimane, who can moderate or facilitate a conversation and invite your comments and your questions.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Karlberg, for those insightful comments. Yeah, we'd love to open it up to questions, so you can put that in the chat and we will address them.
While we're waiting for questions, let me offer an example of one of the things I referred to when I was speaking. So I talked about, growing evidence that competition, in fact, doesn't necessarily drive excellence and innovation in the economy. And this is, I think, one of the hardest things for a lot of people to get their head around. It's been so sort of drilled into us. So let me give an example. Some of you, I can tell, are, as old as me and have been around long enough to have watched Microsoft born and develop. I remember in the 90s when I began using Microsoft products. They quickly began to dominate the market in various ways. And then sometime around the end of the 90s, if you were using Microsoft products then, you might have noticed they really began to have a lot of issues with their software. It became stagnant, and a lot of instabilities were introduced. Some of you might remember the blue screen of death when your computer froze on, every other hour you were using it. It's like, it became increasingly frustrating to use Microsoft products. And a lot of, business researchers began to study this and refer to this as like Microsoft's lost decade. What happened in this decade where Microsoft product, where it went from like the leading company, in the software world to like the bane of everyone's existence, frustrating products and such. How did they stumble so much? And one of the leading explanations is that around that time, Microsoft began to listen to, a lot of management advice coming out of like MBA schools, which essentially said you need to create more effective mechanisms of internal competition within your company to foster more excellence and innovation. So the company was organized into, countless competing units. And within each unit, every member of the unit had to compete on a performance scale in which, if you had a unit of 10 people, only a few would receive excellent reviews, and everyone else had to be essentially sort of, ranked like on a bell curve scale, like students in a classroom. And what that did was everyone began to not share information, to hide information, to not collaborate, but to try to, advance their own sort of desperate position by making other people look bad and trying to look good in comparison. It began to play out within units and across units as units themselves began to control information secretly and not share and collaborate across units. And the net effect was that it paralyzed the company to really sort of continue like the pursuit of excellence and innovation. It's a classic case study in the negative effects of competition on what everybody says it's supposed to produce, which is excellence and innovation. Or let me give you one other example, and this is not in business, this is in the sort of creative arts. There was a really interesting study done on how competition affects creativity in the arts. So a large group of students were brought together and divided into two groups. And both groups were given materials to make collages. And one group was told, here's a bunch of collage materials. You have a couple of hours, be creative, have fun, make the most interesting collages you possibly can. We can't wait to see what you come up with. The other group was told, you're part of a collage competition. Here's your materials. Make the best collage you can, and afterwards we're going to judge them, and one of you is going to win a great prize. So all these students went to work in these two groups, making collages, and afterwards, through a random double-blind study, a group of like professional artists act as a jury and reviewed all these collages without knowing which students were in which groups. And without fail, consistently, they found that the most creative artwork came from the group that was told to go have fun and be creative. And the least creative work came from the group that was told they were competing with one another for a prize. So there are countless studies out there that demonstrate these kinds of things in the business world, in the arts community, and in many other endeavors of human life.
Thank you. Those are interesting to get us to start to think about. We have a question from Alex. What are some social issues you are engaged in applying the principle of world unity? at the present moment? And what are you learning in this endeavor?
Well, I'm involved in quite a few. I do a lot of work on my campus and in my local community around the struggle for racial justice. For instance, I helped develop with some friends, a diverse group of friends in my town, a timeline of the racial history of the small city that I'm in. And a lot of Americans don't have much of a historical perspective on, how the composition of their city evolved. So I'm in a city that's today about 80% white. Only 150 years ago, there wasn't a single white person in the city. It was an indigenous First Nations, part of the country. It hadn't yet been colonized by Western settlers. And within 2 years of the arrival of white people, the indigenous people were forced onto a reservation. And a set of policies and practices over the next 100 years kept the city almost virtually entirely 100% white. And these policies and practices were often violent, directed at new waves of immigrants that tried to, settle here and so forth. And it's a history that most white folks in my city have no consciousness of. They just think, oh, isn't it funny how all these white people sort of accidentally migrated and settled here? So I'm very involved in, for instance, that kind of work. Now, what I've been trying to learn how to do is how to approach that very sensitive and delicate and challenging, issue with a unifying and constructive, sort of approach. And I think this is one of the challenges we face. We as a nation have a horrendous history of racial oppression that I'm sure you're all well familiar enough. Slavery, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, on and on. And it continues in various ways, even though some forms of progress have been made on some fronts. The question is, how do we advance towards racial harmony, towards coexistence and justice in ways that don't continue to alienate and divide and polarize our society? That's a very complex challenge that we haven't figured out yet, like nationwide. So that's an area that I'm quite involved in and trying to learn, along with many Baha'is and many others, how to do this work in unifying and constructive ways.
Thank you. Our next question is from Patricia. How can we have global marketing that really wants the best for humanity and not just selling things?
Say that one more time.
How can we have global marketing that really wants the best for humanity and not just selling things?
Well, that's a great question. My field is communication and media studies. I look a lot at the role of marketing and advertising. And what I'm going to say might sound extreme to some of you. I'm not suggesting this is a specifically sort of Baha'i view, but it's my view as a Baha'i trying to think about the implications of this. I think we need to step back for a minute and think about the role of marketing and advertising in the modern economy. And when we do that, what we recognize is, capitalism, which really is only a couple hundred years old as an economic system in its modern form. It's a very productive system in the sense that it, in essence, solved the problem of scarcity for material things. So for the first time in human history, we're able to produce more stuff than we know what to do with, literally. So the Industrial Revolution and capitalism solved the problem of scarcity, but it created a new problem, which is the problem of oversupply. So we actually had a supply problem in the modern capitalist industrial economy. Too much stuff, not enough demand. Marketing and advertising in its modern form as an industry emerged to solve the demand problem or the oversupply problem. In other words, to artificially stimulate demand. That's what the industry exists for. As a whole, when we think about it as a whole, as an industry. And what it found out fairly quickly was the best way to do this is not even to tell people what all this new stuff, can do for them. It's to actually form emotional attachments to material things and to convince people that happiness will be achieved through material consumption. So we have an industry today whose primary purpose is to stimulate artificially high levels of consumption by creating emotional attachments to material things. That's what the industry does. Now, some of you may work in this industry, and every industry today has problems. I could wax for an hour about the problems in higher education where I exist. So there's no need to take this personally. Every industry today needs to be rethought. And this is one that, that I'm, commenting on right now. So if one thinks about that, then think about the implications of it, the actual social and environmental impacts of this industry, which has stimulated these artificially high levels of desire by basically emotionally manipulating people. The consequences are, first of all, massive amounts of debt, sort of tying people into debt cycles of work and spend and consume that they can't escape from, which has led to enormous levels of unhappiness because people don't have time to do the things that really make them happy, like spending time with loved ones and friends and volunteering in their communities and engaging in arts, creative artistic expression, all these things that make people truly happy. So it's actually created a huge emotional and psychological toll on people's happiness. The other thing it does, because it's stimulated artificially high levels of material consumption, is it's wrecked the planet physically. It's filled the oceans with plastic and the lands with toxic electronic wastes and the atmosphere with so much carbon dioxide that literally the environment has become destabilized. Now, we can't attribute all of those problems to marketing and advertising, right? Every industry is playing a role, but marketing and advertising as an industry has contributed significantly to all of these problems. So if one really begins to ask, like, what's the future of marketing and advertising? One has to, I think, begin with that recognition that there are fundamental problems with the sector that need to be rethought. And here's a solution I explore with students in my class. We, for the first time in human history, have the ability to actually think radically differently about, well, let's say for the first time in the Industrial Revolution, because this industry didn't exist before that, to think about advertising and marketing. We can distinguish between broadly two kinds of advertising and marketing, what you could call push and pull. Push marketing or push advertising is advertising that seeks you out wherever you go. It's pushing advertisement at you wherever you go, over the internet, billboards on the side of the highway, you name it, the radio, the television, so forth. Pull advertisement is where you realize you have a need, a problem you want to solve in your life, and you figure someone out there's probably created a solution for this, and you want to find where that product or service is. So you search for information. You pull it towards you. You pull information towards you. So think about this distinction, push and pull advertising. Well, with the internet, we now have the capacity to search for information in incredibly efficient ways. I mean, I wake up in the morning and I've got some problem that's real and I feel I need to solve. I hop on the internet and I can find a solution. Like, oh yeah, somebody thought of this. They've created a product and it meets this real need that I have now. So we literally are in a position where we could eliminate push advertisement entirely from the world. Simply regulate it out of existence and regulate all marketing and advertisement to one domain of the internet, that if people wanted to go into and look for products and services to solve real needs, they could easily find what they wanted and purchase them. Think about what the implications of that radical change would be. First of all, we would probably stop artificially consuming all sorts of things we don't really need and then throwing them into the landfills, right? It would be a step towards creating a more ecologically sustainable economy. It would probably also free us from the burden of, work, spend, debt cycle that so many people are on that I alluded to earlier, because we wouldn't have, messages constantly sort of manipulating us into thinking we needed something to be happy. Now, I'm not suggesting that what I just described is on the immediate horizon. We're not going to have this in 5 years or 10 years or probably in my lifetime. But as a species, we can, for the first time, begin to think in these ways, in sort of fundamental systemic ways about the role of these industries. And in that context that I just offered, there's still a really important role for marketing and advertisement. It would just be organized in an entirely different way. One other thing I'd say about this, if you made this shift, it would have an incredible stimulating effect on local entrepreneurship and local economy. Because the way the marketing and advertising industry works today is it allows huge monopoly-like industries to saturate national and even global markets with advertisements that convince people to buy its products at the expense of locally produced products. So let me just give a really simple example. Think about soda or cola, right? Which, arguably isn't even a healthy product to begin with, but a lot of people drink it, it's out there. Think about what Coca-Cola and Pepsi have done to sort of dominate that market globally. Massive multi-million-dollar advertising campaigns year in and year out all over the globe. Well, turns out cola is something that any local, entrepreneur can make for pennies and sell. But there's hardly any market because of the imbalance in marketing and advertising. They simply can't compete for people's attention or make people aware of it. Now, and as I say, like cola, I don't even drink cola, so I'm not promoting this. I'm just saying it's an example of how the way the modern marketing and advertising industry works actually promotes sort of the accumulation of wealth in larger and larger industries at the expense of local entrepreneurship and local economy. So my guess is shifting from push advertisement to pull advertisement like this would also have an enormous stimulating effect on local entrepreneurship and local economy.
Thank you.
Sorry, that was maybe long-winded, but.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Next question is from Paul. Thank you, Professor, for these insights. I'm an economist, so my views are also colored by the competition idea. I agree that collaboration is a very essential mode of operation. I was going to bring up the Microsoft example, in fact, just before you did. I also remember Microsoft's abusive monopoly of 20 to 30 years ago. Thank goodness for young competitive startups like Apple that released us from their monopoly. Would you agree that monopolies can be very abusive and competitive startups can be very useful for society? Today, we worry about Facebook, Google, and Amazon exercising market powers. And a few decades ago, it was the US car industry that had to learn to do much better when facing better products from Japan.
Yeah, so I would absolutely agree that monopolies are problematic, that the sort of over-concentration of power and wealth in any industry like that becomes problematic. And I also want to clarify I'm not in any way advocating like a centrally planned economy, Soviet style sort of centrally planned economy. So it's not a communist, economic prescription that I'm advocating. Markets clearly have a very important role to play in human society. Markets are useful mechanisms for many things. The challenge, I would say, with markets is, first of all, they only work well when A, market actors are acting on moral motivations. B, when governments can regulate markets in thoughtful, careful ways. Because every economist knows markets have a few shortcomings that are obvious. One is there's a tendency towards natural monopoly that's built into many sectors and markets that can only be addressed through government regulation. Another failing of markets is that they're unable to provide certain forms of public goods and services, like infrastructure, for instance, that there's really no market incentive or mechanism to provide. Markets can't build, a highway system or a rail system across the country in the ways that they can maybe, create widgets and cars and whatever. So provision of public service is something that governments clearly have a role to play in. And the last thing that markets don't do well is they don't factor in what economists call externalities, the external costs of production and consumption that nobody pays for within the exchange, within the market exchange. So pollution is a classic example. And all the health costs associated with people, breathing in like downwind, cancerous smoke. Who pays for that? Well, the producer and the consumer don't. The person who gets cancer does. And in essence, the person who gets cancer subsidizes the artificially low cost of that product. It takes government regulation to solve that problem. Markets can't do it. So those are just a few examples of the limits of markets, which we can recognize while also recognizing the value of markets. Assuming also that market actors bring moral sort of motives into those interactions, which is a whole nother important question we could ask, like how do you foster those? So with that, let me add one other thing. So then that raises the question of how should we understand markets? Capitalism, people debate the term capitalism, like what does it even mean? Economists debate how to define capitalism. The only useful definition I've arrived at for what is capitalism is that capitalism is a particular way of organizing markets. In other words, markets can be organized in a lot of ways. Capitalism is one framework for organizing markets. What capitalism does is organize markets to privilege the accumulation of capital above all other values, right? That's what capitalism does. So it's one way to organize a market that privileges the accumulation of capital, or in other words, the concentration of wealth above all other values. Well, what other values are there you might want to factor into a market? Well, obviously, environmental sustainability might be one, right? Maybe some reasonably just distribution of wealth might be another. Maybe things like worker health and safety. So there are other values one could bring to organizing a market that capitalism tends to ignore because it's a particular, way of organizing. So what I would say is there's an important role for markets, provided you have morally motivated market actors, both consumers and producers, companies, provided you have governments that can regulate them in just and sustainable and thoughtful ways and not over-regulate them. And provided that markets are not only organized around the value of accumulating capital at all other expense. And, once you think about the kind of market I'm alluding to, then the question becomes up, well, what's the role of competition within that market? which I think part of the question is being posed. And this is where I would say we need to also unpack the notion of competition a little. What do we mean by competition? And again, we could argue over definitions and various things, but let me offer, a productive way of thinking about it that I've arrived at, or that I think is productive. And it's this, that competition, at least as we tend to use the term in the modern world, it doesn't just mean striving for excellence. It means striving for excellence with self-interested motives. That's an important distinction. Clearly, we all want to see more striving for excellence in every domain of human existence, including the economy. We want more creativity, productivity, innovation, excellence. Those are good things. But those things don't have to be wedded to self-interested motivations. And when those things are wedded together, that's what I think we can call competition. It's a self-interested posture. Now, if we begin to take striving for excellence and innovation and creativity and wed them to altruistic motives, cooperative motives, and motives to contribute to the betterment of humanity as a whole, while paying our bills at home, should we still call that competition? I'm not sure. I think we can just call it striving for excellence in the economy. And clearly, the economy should reward people who strive for excellence and are creative and innovative. But it doesn't have to be driven by self-interested motives. So let me just give one concrete example of how this distinction bears out. If one enters the economy, the market, purely with the goal of making money in a self-interested way, like if that's the only reason you're there, well, there are all sorts of ways to do that contribute nothing to the betterment of humanity. You could come up with a new brand of toothpaste that was essentially identical to every other brand of toothpaste. And you could just pull together enough investors so you could overwhelm the market with marketing and advertising and sort of manipulate a bunch of people into thinking your toothpaste was better. And you could make a whole lot of money that way. And you've contributed absolutely nothing to the betterment of humanity. I think that's a form of self-interested market action. As opposed to, let's say you really are convinced there's a better way to make a new kind of toothpaste that will fundamentally, reduce cavities, at a whole nother scale. And you invest and you do your research and you come up with a product and you offer it to the market. The market should reward you. You should be able to earn a living doing that. And in the process, you've contributed to the betterment of humanity by reducing cavities in that case. But your motivation doesn't have to be self-interested. So these are subtle distinctions, but they're important distinctions. Start unpack, what do we mean by markets? What do we mean by capitalism? What do we mean by competition?
Thank you. Our next question is from Craig. I think it was one of the Baha'i prophets who said that cooperation is not the same as equalitarianism. Can you explain?
Yeah, so Abdu'l-Baha, who was Baha'u'llah's eldest son, who, by the way, accompanied Baha'u'llah into exile at the age of 8 and remained a prisoner until he was 65. Think about that. Abdu'l-Baha was a prisoner from the age of 8 years old to the age of 65. And he was by his father's side through most of that imprisonment. And Baha'u'llah told the Baha'is that Abdu'l-Baha was the perfect example of his teachings. So Abdu'l-Baha plays a very unique role in the Baha'i faith. Well, Abdu'l-Baha talked quite a bit about this. So Abdu'l-Baha traveled to the West. He actually traveled to the United States from coast to coast. And he spoke in public gatherings, with dignitaries, with all sorts of people, sharing the message of Baha'u'llah. And it was in 1912, which was exactly the same time that the Bolshevik Revolution was getting off the ground in Russia and in Europe. The sort of rise of sort of vanguard communism, right? And so that was on people's minds. And, you know, the communist message, the kind of strict Marxist communist message, was a vision of a world of total equality, a kind of absolute equality in a sense. And Abdu'l-Baha was very clear that not only is that impossible, but it would be harmful. So what Abdu'l-Baha talked about instead was eliminating the extremes of wealth and poverty. And that's the relevant Baha'i principle here. Baha'is don't believe that one can impose some sort of absolute equality, because people do have different kinds of talents and capacities and different circumstances, and, you know, work in different ways and to different effect. And markets should reward those to some extent, but within limits. And we're so far beyond those limits today in how the market functions that, you know, 3 people in the United States have more wealth than half of the population. That's so far beyond the sort of extreme, the tolerable extremes, that it creates other problems, arguably even worse. Social conflict and instability and you know, the corruption of governance and all these things. So yeah, Abdu'l-Baha was really clear. Baha'is don't believe in some sort of absolute imposed equality, but we believe in the elimination of extremes of wealth and poverty.
Thank you. Our next question is from Wilmer. Thank you so much for such a meaningful presentation. During my 2 years teaching Chinese students in China, I showed your videos about today's subject, Beyond the Culture of Contest, at TEDx. Most Chinese students agreed with the principles shared in the video, and they were thankful for bringing to them such day-to-day struggles that they were immersed in. For me, it was difficult to offer a practical alternative where they can practice what you offer as solutions, because all they know is based on competition. Nowadays, I'm in touch with many of my Chinese students. What do you recommend for these Chinese students to practice and start to believe that we have to drop completely this culture of contests that we are all immersed in?
Well, you know, I think we have to be careful prescribing like formulas and specific models. I think what we have are not, you know, what Baha'is offer are not like a blueprint, a detailed blueprint for how the economy should be reorganized, for instance, or how corporations should run, or even in these other spheres like education, you know, what's the role of competition. I think what we have are a set of principles that we need now to work out their implications in practice through a learning process, systematic learning. In essence, it's like if you're an engineer and you're trying to get a rocket to the moon, you know, think about before the space race started, right? In the United States in the late 50s, we didn't know how to send a rocket to the moon. We didn't have any idea. And if someone had come to us and said, here, I've got the blueprint for a rocket that's going to go to the moon, it would have been nonsense. Nobody had any clue. What we did have were the principles of physics, which were well understood by this time. You know, at least a good body of principles of physics that were well understood. And we had engineers who could apply those principles through a complicated collective process that took some time and eventually generate the sort of applied knowledge that would send humans to the moon. That's kind of the situation we're in now. Baha'u'llah brought a set of social and spiritual principles that in many ways are like the principles of physics. We have to work out the implications ourselves. We have to generate knowledge collectively about how to apply these principles to solve different kinds of problems in different spheres. So in the economy, I think that's kind of where we are right now. Baha'is don't have all the answers or detailed kind of formulaic, you know, models or blueprints. But we have these principles, and we invite people, and we look for like-minded people. It's not like Baha'is have a monopoly on these principles either. I mean, growing segments of humanity are tuning into these principles, so to speak. I mean, are aware of these principles, arriving at them in independent ways often. So how do we work with like-minded people to apply these principles, generate knowledge about how to do these things better? So I think with, conversation with your Chinese, friends and colleagues, I think this is the kind of approach we need to take. And because China's starting from a different starting point than the US, then that learning process is going to unfold differently there in some ways, right? One other thing I'll add, though, and it has to do with like applying principles to social change in a learning process. If we're trying to create a more just world, a world organized around the principle of justice, we have to make sure we pay special attention in the learning process to the voices of those who have the most experience with injustice. Because who better to help us figure out how to create just, social arrangements than people who are most familiar with injustice? In other words, who have experienced the most injustice. And I'll be honest, that's not me, right? I was born into relative privilege. I mean, not wealth, but I'm male, I'm white, and, university professor, middle-class American. I'm not an expert on injustice. So we need to give voice to people who have those kinds of experiences in these learning processes. It becomes especially important. Obviously, there's a place for all of us in this learning process. I'm not suggesting I don't have any place. I mean, I need to shoulder my share of this burden and contribute and learn and engage too. But everyone has specific insights, talents, experiences they bring to this process. And some people have been excluded from these kinds of things historically that we need to make a special effort today to learn how to include.
Thank you. Our next question is from Manije. Thank you so much for your insightful talk. What are your thoughts on the goals and objectives of the 2030 Agenda SDGs, inclusiveness being one of the recurrent terms, even inclusive industrialization, and above all, to leave no one behind?
Yeah, so the SDGs are the Sustainable Development Goals, in case people aren't familiar with that. So this is a UN framework to really think about how does the world develop more sustainable approaches to development itself. I'm not an expert on those goals. I don't work specifically like within this sort of UN framework, although I admire what I've seen. I think, one of the challenges and limitations with a lot of these kinds of frameworks is that they don't yet know how to sort of foster the moral empowerment dimension of this. So they tend to focus more at the policy level, which is important. Policies matter, right? Policies matter, laws matter, but they're never sufficient by themselves. The other dimension of this is one has to foster moral development, moral empowerment at the level of individuals and communities to supplement policies. And it's very difficult for an institution like the UN to sort of focus on that dimension of things. It's a secular institution, it's limited by its participants who are governments, largely secular, who, frankly, aren't in the business of moral empowerment and probably can't be. But I think it's important to sort of explore this other dimension and think, well, where does that work occur? How does that advance? And it kind of goes back partly to what I talked about earlier, like markets only work if market actors have moral integrity, moral, moral motivations. Otherwise, the most well thought out policies and laws and regulations in the world will always be circumvented by people who lack integrity and are just motivated by sort of crass self-interest. You cannot solve all the problems of the world with just laws. It's a bit like racism in the United States. You know, after the civil rights movement in the 60s, and, you know, we got rid of Jim Crow legislation, ushered in a whole bunch of new policies with, you know, universal voting access and school integration and so forth. That was a great policy victory. But because racism was still present in the hearts and minds of large segments of the society, it just mutated into new forms. You know, the school to prison pipeline and mass incarceration of Black people and, you know, other forms of economic disenfranchisement that were more subtle. You know, again, we could go on, you're probably all quite familiar with this. The last few years, fortunately, have been a great education of the American public on how racism continues to work. You can't solve all of the problems of racism with policies, although obviously policies are important. We do need to make sure everyone has, you know, equal access to voting and good education and healthcare and, you know, and on and on and on. There are policies that are relevant. But the question of moral development and moral empowerment is, in some ways, it's the work that, well, it's the work of religion. I mean, it's why we need religion. And of course, it's why religion itself needs to be renewed, because many ancient religions have over time been corrupted by human, you know, the human lust for power and privilege and these sorts of things. So religion itself needs to be renewed from age to age. And this is what Baha'is understand the message of Baha'u'llah has done, given us a sort of framework for thinking about religion and applying these principles in a modern age with sort of fresh impulse and motivation.
Thank you. Our next question is from Ed. What can a few individuals do locally to be most effective in change towards cooperation?
Well, you know, there are probably many, many things people could be doing. You know, beginning with just waking up in the morning every day and asking oneself that question, you know, how do I learn how to do this better on a daily basis in my daily practices? And, you know, in my workplace and among my neighbors and all these things. You know, I can say within the Baha'i community, we have a framework for action we're trying to sort of implement and, you know, learn and advance, and in collaboration with like-minded neighbors and friends and individuals, in which first we're trying to focus on fostering the moral, spiritual development of children in our neighborhoods. Like, who's tending to that? Public schools really can't. It's not their job in a secular nation to really foster moral development in children and the spiritual concepts that children need to grow morally, to develop a framework. So Baha'is and others are trying to figure out, how do we foster the spiritual, you know, education of children in our neighborhoods? And I'm not just talking about Baha'i children, I'm talking about all children. And how do we work with people from all faith backgrounds to do that? That's like a practical question that we have to begin solving. We can't just leave it to the government or to our public schools or to these overworked school teachers to do all that work. And I think this is about fostering the foundations of a more cooperative order, because it begins with children in their formative age, right? That's what I mean by like the moral and spiritual development of children. We also can ask the same question about adolescents who are going through their second formative age. How do you foster the moral and spiritual empowerment of adolescents? How do you help them navigate that difficult period in life and channel their energies and their sort of budding sense of justice towards the betterment of their communities, rather than in, you know, vandalism and drugs and video games and all the, you know, distractions and entertainments and whatnot? That's another very practical question that can only be solved at the neighborhood level. It can't, governments can't pass some sweeping policy that somehow magically fosters moral empowerment in adolescence. We can ask the same thing, with youth and adults, and like, how do we train and mobilize, youth and adults then to become protagonists of change in their neighborhoods, to work more effectively with others, to engage in forms of social action that promote well-being, to play a role in, with children and adolescents, like all these things. These are practical questions about training and mobilizing for change that by and large have to advance neighborhood by neighborhood, village by village, town by town, from the bottom up, not from the top down. So these are, Baha'is have a framework for action in which we're working in these ways. We invite others to join us. They don't need to be Baha'i or become Baha'i to join us in these efforts. And of course, we also collaborate in other ways, with other kinds of, local volunteer services and in our professions and these sorts of things to try to advance these processes.
Thank you. Our next question is from Manucher. Is our future culture based on cooperation and competition, or just on cooperation?
Again, these are kind of definitional questions. Ultimately, what do we mean? How are we defining competition, for instance? My personal view is, I think we should let the language of competition, I think we should let go of it. I don't think it serves us anymore, the language of competition. But what we can't let go of is the language of excellence and creativity and innovation and how you foster those things. So and when I say the language of, language matters. I work in communication. One of the things we study is the way language impacts us, like the way language shapes thought, for instance. So language matters. And I think in this sense, maybe it's time we begin to let go of the language of competition without letting go of the language of excellence and so forth. So I guess in my view, the future ideal society we're trying to create is one that finds a different language to talk about excellence and motivation.
Thank you. Our next question is from Shahla. I think going back to the discussion of the market, she says, don't we also need to be educated and educate our children to know the difference between needs and wants? If we know that difference, we can change the market.
Yeah, absolutely. And ironically, it's a kind of re-education because, historically, humans understood the difference between needs and wants. It was the rise of this mass marketing and advertising industry that actually created and confused desires and wants with needs. And you can look explicitly at the language of the earliest marketers who were developing the techniques. And this is explicitly what they talked about. They said, we need to foster wants and desires in people and make them think they are needs. So this education in some ways is undoing that process of kind of mass education by the marketing industry that we receive, the kind of an indoctrination of kinds. So yeah, absolutely, we need to do that. But we can't put all the burden on the individual. These systems and industries also need to change. It's kind of like an example I give, one of the things I teach is media literacy, or critical media literacy. Basically, how do you interact with the media in a healthy way? How do you defend yourself from potentially harmful or manipulative media messages, right? There's a whole field that's looked at this, and it's part of what I teach. But let me give you an example of the limits of that. So imagine, many of you don't have to imagine, many of you were a young girl growing up in this society. And you're exposed on a daily basis to patently harmful messages trying to convince you that you're not thin enough, you're not white enough, you're not, your skin isn't good enough, your breasts aren't large enough, on and on and on and on. Everything that's somehow wrong with you, in order to convince you to spend money on products and services that frankly you don't even need. Now, you can educate young girls to understand the nature of those harmful messages and try to give them a little bit of intellectual self-defense so they don't go over the end with, terrible mental health disorders, anorexia and bulimia and body image, dysmorphia and all these things. But there are limits to what you can do. If the environment doesn't change, even the most well-educated young girl will still be affected by these images. It's kind of like saying you're growing up in an atmosphere that's saturated with poisonous smoke, and you're breathing it every day. And someone comes along and they say, I'm going to educate you about how this smoke is affecting you and all the damage it's doing. And I try to give you a few techniques to minimize the damage, like hold your breath more often, whatever. Go in that little far corner of the room down there where the air is just a little bit better and do most of your breathing there. It's like you ultimately have to get rid of the smoke. You can't just place all the burden on the person growing up in that environment. And it's the same with girls and these hostile, media environment that they grow up in. And of course, the same is true for boys in other ways, right? Boys are harmed in all sorts of ways by this media environment as well. And again, you can't just put all the burden on them with some, critical media literacy to sort of navigate all this. You have to also change the media environment. So both are necessary. And they interact over time, hopefully to lead us in the right direction.
Thank you. Ed asks, do you have any suggestions for artists in this transformational process?
Oh boy, I was like a wannabe artist one day. That was my initial sort of career, and I found it so difficult to make a living and moved in another direction. And I have great sympathy and love for artists. It's a very hard time to be an artist. 95% of the artistic talent in this country is basically, if they want to earn a living, is channeled into marketing and advertising or other sort of commercial activities like that. That is not what most artists initially aspire to art. But if you want, so it's very hard for artists to make a living today. And again, I don't know, I don't have some formulaic solution. I think a few things need to change. One is, even though many people ought to be able to earn their living with the arts, every human being should have more time to engage in the arts, even without compensation, just as an expression of what it means to be human. We should all find our artistic outlets, not necessarily as a job, but as a full part of a human life. But to do that, we need time. 100 years ago, as technology and workplace efficiency was advancing, economists realized, wow, at this rate, we'll be able to provide, all human needs, and people only need to work 10, 20 hours a week because labor productivity was increasing so steadily. Already 100 years ago, economists began to see this, and they began to think, oh my God, 100 years from now, it's going to be amazing. People can have so much time for artistic pursuits and community volunteering and all the things that their hearts desire, and they're only going to have to work 10, 20 hours a week. And in fact, what they predicted is exactly what happened. Human productivity has increased to the point where we could all meet our needs working 10 or 20 hours a week. But what they didn't predict was all of that surplus productivity would be funneled into the hands of very few people who would become enormously wealthy. So the productivity dividend that we were promised never occurred. It was in essence stolen from the masses. Now, we need to fix this situation. We could easily have a world where we only had to work for pay for 10 or 20 hours a week. And we have the means to do that now. The problem is the distribution of wealth makes it impossible because it's siphoned off into the hands of very few people. So imagine this world where we only have to work 10 or 20 hours a week. And now ask, what is the role of the arts in your life? Hopefully there will, even in that world, hopefully there will be people who will be able to specialize in certain kind of arts and earn a living because other people will appreciate their work so much, they'll support it in various ways. But hopefully all the rest of us will also be able to express our our creativity in various forms of arts as active participants, not just consumers of other people's art. So there's probably a lot more one could explore about how to foster an economy that supports arts. But I think the starting point is, how do we free ourselves up so that we all can develop that aspect of ourselves?
Thank you. Our next question is from Amy. You mentioned justice as the principle at the foundation of a more Baha'i society. Would you tell us more about how the meaning of justice shifts if we move from contest to collaboration?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I have given thought to that. So, in a culture of contest, what justice comes to mean is rules of fair play for competition and punishing people who break the rules, right? That's kind of the highest aspiration for justice in a culture of contest is how do we create fair competition and how do we punish people when we break those rules? So that's largely what justice means in the modern world today, in practice. Now, we don't even really have fully fair rules of competition, and we certainly don't enforce the rules equally or fairly. The system's got all sorts of flaws, but in essence, that's how justice is sort of rationalized and organized. If we think about society not as an arena of competition for scarce resources, but as an interdependent social body in which there are adequate resources for everyone, but we need to organize our relationships in such a way that actually, promote collective well-being. In that context, justice takes on a different meaning. And the way I understand it is, what it comes to mean is justice is a condition of the social body in which every individual and member, every cell and organ, so to speak, to use that analogy, right? Every individual person and every group, social group has the opportunity to develop their latent capacities, their latent potential, to contribute to the enrichment of the whole body. That's what justice starts to mean. So through that lens, one begins to look at every obstacle to the development of human potentiality as an injustice. Whether that obstacle is poverty, racism, sexism, on and on and on, right? All of those things become obstacles to justice. So it's not just about rules of fair play and punishing people who break the rules. It's about creating conditions for human flourishing and removing barriers. And in that context, of course, one still needs some rules. One still needs some laws, one still needs to be able to deal with people who just sort of flagrantly interfere with the development of other people. But the focus shifts.
Thank you. So I think in the interest of time, we'll close off the questions there. But thank you so much to Dr. Karlberg for that really insightful talk and all the follow-up conversation as well. Thank you to everyone also for attending and giving your insight. So our topic and speaker next week will be a conversation with Justin Baldoni about the Baha'i Faith. And again, these talks are every Saturday at noon Eastern time. So please invite your friends and family. And if you'd like to be on the weekly mailing list, you can fill out the contact form that I'll put in the chat, and it's also in the description box of our YouTube videos. We're going to close today with a quotation by Abdul Baha set to music.
Strive that your actions day by day may be beautiful prayers. Turn towards God and seek always to do that which is right and noble. Enrich the poor, raise the fallen, comfort the sorrowful, bring healing to the sick, reassure the fearful, rescue the oppressed, bring hope to the hopeless, shelter the destitute. Strive that your actions day by day may be beautiful prayers. Turn towards God and seek always to do that which is right and noble. Enrich the poor, raise the fallen, comfort the sorrowful, bring healing to the sick, reassure the fearful, rescue the oppressed, bring hope to the hopeless, shelter the destitute. Strive that your actions day by day may be beautiful prayers. Turn towards God and seek always to do that which is right and noble. Enrich the poor, raise the fallen, comfort the sorrowful, bring healing to the sick, reassure the fearful, rescue the oppressed, bring hope to the hopeless, shelter the destitute. Strive that your actions day by day may be beautiful prayers. Turn towards God and seek always to do that which is right and noble. Enrich the poor, raise the fallen, comfort the sorrowful, bring healing to the sick, reassure the fearful, rescue the oppressed, bring hope to the hopeless, shelter the destitute.
Thank you, everyone. See you next week.